the aftermath of the failed Iran-US talks in Islamabad, Iran has now made its position clear. The core issue was trust, and Washington failed to build it. Iran's parliamentary speaker Mohammad Baqer Ghalibaf, who was part of the negotiating team, said the Iranian delegation had put forward what he described as forward-looking initiatives during the discussions. However, he stressed that despite these proposals, the US ultimately failed to gain the trust of the Iranian side, leading to the collapse of this round of negotiations. In a message posted on social media platform X, Ghalibaf said, and I quote here, "The US has understood Iran's logic and principles, and it's now time for them to decide whether they can earn our trust or not," unquote. His remarks underline the deep mistrust that continues to define relations between the two sides, even as diplomatic channels remain open. At the same time, Ghalibaf acknowledged Pakistan's role, expressing gratitude for its efforts in facilitating the talks and bringing both sides to the table. The high-stakes diplomatic push between the US and Iran has ended without a breakthrough, but not without making history. After nearly 21 hours of intense discussions and negotiations in Islamabad, US Vice President J.D. Vance made it clear, and I quote here, "Iran chose not to accept our terms. This was no ordinary meeting. For the first time since the 1979 Islamic Revolution of Iran, the top political leadership from Washington and Tehran sat across the table." Representing Iran was Parliament Speaker Mohammad Baqer Ghalibaf, signaling just how serious both sides were after weeks of conflict. The backdrop to these talks is critical. Just 6 weeks ago, US strikes killed Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, pushing the region to the brink. Since then, more than 1,700 lives have been lost, and tensions have spiraled into a full-blown geopolitical crisis. And yet, despite the hostility, both sides came to the table. But the deadlock remains. 3 major sticking points dominated the negotiations. First, the strategic Strait of Hormuz. The US wants it reopened immediately, as nearly 1/5 of global oil supply passes through this narrow route. Iran, however, sees it as its strongest leverage, even reportedly imposing transit costs on vessels. Second, Iran's nuclear program. Washington demanded a complete shutdown. Tehran refused, insisting its right to enrich uranium under international treaties cannot be compromised. This mirrors the earlier nuclear deal, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPA, which took years to negotiate and allowed limited enrichment. Today, those positions appear even more hardened. Finally, third, money. Iran is demanding the release of nearly $27 billion in frozen assets to rebuild after weeks of devastating strikes. The US has rejected this demand, adding another layer to the stalemate. So where do things stand now? Well, US Vice President J.D. Vance has left the door open, calling the US proposal its best and final offer. Iran is expected to consult its leadership before responding. There's a fragile 2-week ceasefire in place, offering a narrow window for diplomacy, but uncertainties remain. Israel's next move under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu could complicate the situation further, especially with ongoing strikes in Lebanon. So while the talks in Islamabad have paused, the bigger story is far from over. For the first time in decades, the US and Iran are talking again. But whether that leads to peace or another phase of this conflict remains the biggest question. We have Major General SVP Singh, strategy and defense expert, joining us. We also I'm going to be discussing this story further with him. Thank you so much, Major General SVP Singh, strategy and defense expert, for being with us over here on the broadcast. Talk to us. The big question that we're asking: US and Iran have come forward for talks in decades. The talks have collapsed. The ceasefire technically remains in place. US says, in the form of its vice president, that it's up to Iran now to consult with its leadership and get back on what he calls his US's best offer. Do you think, after further consultations, a deal could still be reached within this ceasefire, or do you expect the ceasefire to collapse?
Thank you, Krishna. It's an honor to be with News 9 and with you first time. Uh, well, it's a very tinderbox-like situation, which it has been for the 40 plus days already. Now, there was a lot of hope of this ceasefire having been announced, but there was also no certainty that these talks in Islamabad could or would succeed because the demands of either side, 15 points from the United States, 10 points from the Iranian side, they were not converging anywhere in any of the issues. So for that, 21 hours, perhaps, to my mind, would not suffice because issue by issue, nut bolts have to be discussed. And there has to be convergence if both sides are genuine for peace. Iran today claims that US is not genuine and there is a big amount of mistrust, distrust existing. Now, having said so, you also ask if is this a failure or there's a hope? Well, all wars, they only end at the table. Take the First World War, League of Nations, Second World War, the United Nations Organization, even as close as 1973 Arab-Israeli War, the Camp David Accord. They all worked on the table, meeting each other. So I would say if I compare the past historical examples, there is hope. 2 week ceasefire, lot of background work will be on. And to that extent, maybe they would come back to the table. If not, then the stakes are very high. The stakes are very high to the extent that when the ceasefire was announced, Iran was threatened with civilization destruction, which is a very severe threat. Now, what is the gap here? The gap is basically the intent gap on the nuclear future of Iran. And the US demands that a permanent, verifiable commitment from Iran to forswear the nuclear weapons and its infrastructure. Now, Iran, on its part, demands right to enriched uranium as a prerequisite, and they take this issue as non-negotiable because they're members also signatory to the Nuclear Proliferation Treaty. So as a sovereign nation, Iran has a point. Now, this ceasefire, the peace agreement is now, and the sovereignty part, which I said, is pitted against security. And maybe Iran is wanting its sovereignty and not to bow down or not to fall prey with the Libyan example, the Libyan deal of 2003, when Gaddafi had agreed to dismantle his nuclear infrastructure, everything. And then when 2011 in Libya, the civil war broke out, then everything was lost to Libya, including Gaddafi. And the NATO really bombed them out because they had no power. So Iran would not submit to that. And another parallel example is North Korea. We call it a barrier state. But no one is interfering with them because of its nuclear might, nuclear power. So these are two contrasting examples which Iran wants to ensure its security. Now, also, US is comparing destruction versus commitment to my mind. That is, they are telling Iranian party, I would assume, that you have already suffered so much of destruction. So much of requirement is there. You want reparation. So why not come out with a commitment of will to follow this up in a manner where we can converge? But again, I come back, it tantamounts to surrender of Iran's sovereignty. So for Iran, it's a security dilemma. And for the Middle East, Israel, it is the security of its existence. because Iranian regime had committed to wipe Israel off the map. Now that's a very serious one. And to do so, Iran has worked its way through an axis of resistance. Now that crescent which forms, starting from Lebanon, Hezbollah, Syria, which now, of course, is now a little tamed, Iraqi militias, then coming through Iran onto the Yemen side. So these are very serious things which we have to see. And in the international environment, the world wants to be terrorist free. India wants a very strong anti terrorism action to be in play. We are always demanding that in all international organizations. So I think terrorism also, by itself, becomes a subclause of the overall agreement of the ceasefire. Over to you, Krishna.
Right, fair enough. Stay with us, sir, because the Trump administration now faces two difficult choices. The first, a prolonged and complex negotiation with Iran over its nuclear program, something Washington has shown little appetite for, given that past deals took years to conclude. The second and far more dangerous option is the possibility of renewed military action. The fragile ceasefire is already under strain, and failure of talks raises the risk of the conflict escalating once again. At the heart of the crisis, of course, lies the Strait of Hormuz, the critical global oil artery. Control over this route has now become a central point of contention. With its disruption already shaking global energy markets, the economic fallout could be severe. The earlier phase of the conflict had already disrupted nearly 20% of global oil supplies, pushing fuel prices higher and fueling inflation across economies. For US President Trump, the stakes are equally high. While he has projected strength, the option of returning to war carries significant political and economic risks, both domestically and globally. Meanwhile, Iran has shown no signs of backing down. If anything, weeks of conflict appear to have hardened its position, making any immediate compromise even more difficult. What emerges now is a volatile scenario where diplomacy has stalled, mistrust runs deep, and the next move could determine whether the region steps back from the brink or slides into a prolonged conflict. Major General SVP Singh, this is where it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen, but let's also talk about what is already happening. Israel has barely ceased its attacks on Hezbollah, and that could put everything into a tailspin amidst all these negotiations.
Yes, Krishna, it's like this, that Israel has been very, very rigid in its stance because of its vulnerability, the deep vulnerability to its own security and existential threat. So now Lebanon, what has happened on the Lebanon front is the creation of Hezbollah, 1982 Lebanon war, and post it. Now that has been a major threat. What basically we see, Israel is wanting that Hezbollah should withdraw north of the Litani River. And Israelis are already breathing down on the Litani River. Now, that one is the first requirement of Israel to calm down things, if at all, on the Lebanon front. And other thing which has been working with Israel is that there's Operation Epic Fury and Operation Roaring Lion, coordinated coalition force. Israel sees it as an opportunity to its grand strategy, which has started to come into play actively once again historically with the Gaza and the Gaza being reduced to rubbles, and then this West Bank also now firmly in control of Israel. So the greater Israel, which is the grand strategy of Israel, comes into play. It comes into focus because Lebanon, they claim as part of that, the Syrian area also they claim parts of Jordan. So slowly, as I would like to put it, it's a salami slicing which is taking place, but at great cost, which has been on since October 2023. Now, we say that Hamas was reduced, but ideologues and ideology never fades away. And same way, Hezbollah suffered so much in those 1.5 years of that war which was taking place. Yet, Hezbollah has still got the strength. They have the rocket and missile strength. They are targeting Haifa. They are targeting the northern Israel areas. So, Israel now wants to exercise this opportunity and not be part of the ceasefire. To my mind, when we talk of ceasefire and United States is indulging, it is the senior partner of the coalition. Iran has a point of view that ceasefire should be across the battlefield, not only the battlefield, the entire zone, the region. And that's what can then take you forward better with more trust on the table for ceasefire discussions.